Welcome to History and Future of Mostly Higher Education. Hi, welcome back. And look what I found. I'm excited. I found, thanks to Jason Doty at the John Hope Franklin Center, who is the designer. He runs the Franklin Center now. I found these posters from some of the first podcasting conferences we held at Duke. In the folder that went with this, the planning folders, the word podcasting is even in quotation marks. We weren't quite sure what to call this new phenomenon. But here's one called On Air that takes place in September of 2005. And Mimi Ito is speaking, Dana Boyd is speaking, some of my very favorite scholars on new technology and youth. How nostalgic. Goes back. Here's Podcast 5 Academy. This one's from 2007. Our 5th annual conference. Pretty exciting to go back and look in the vault and see what was happening in that distant era of 2003, 4, 5, and 7. Today we're going to be talking a little bit more distantly about the Humboldtian University in the 19th century and the origins of the research university and the educational system we've all inherited today. As with everything else, it's an activist purpose of history. We're not going to be spending a lot of time on the details. We're more looking at the big picture, the motivations, and what informed the creation of the modern university and how relevant those ideas are to the present, what's good, what we can take into the future, and what, frankly, we have to change. The modern university of the 19th century is often referred to as the Humboldtian University. It's named after Wilhelm von Humboldt, a German educator who based his work on the ideas of Friedrich Schleiermacher, a German philosopher who emphasized the importance not of memorization, recitation, and repeating authorized knowledge, but of producing new knowledge. He and the University of Berlin, the first Humboldtian university, struck recitation from its most important credentialing and instead relied on labs, on seminars, and on the idea that the student in higher education should be a researcher under the tutelage of a professor, but also be looking not again to prove the lessons of the past or memorize the lessons of the past, but to produce new knowledge. Again, not to preserve accepted ancient knowledge, but to discover and advance new knowledge. Those are metaphors, of course, and they're the appropriate metaphors for the industrial age. This was a great age of energy and innovation, in addition to being an age of mechanization and automation. And the Humboldtian University was designed to create the most productive, innovative thinkers and to encourage experimentation and exploration. Probably the biggest contrast in 19th century education was between the French system and the German system. The German system was looking at being modern, being new, taking some of those ideas from Kant about what the filter is that allows us to see the world, and developing that filter in a more research-oriented, innovative, and productive way, versus the French, who were much more disciplinary, much more hierarchical, who were very, very interested in what is required in order to fulfill the degrees from the most prestigious university. The École Normale Supérieure was by far the most prestigious university. Everything was ranked below it. British education is a little bit of a combination of those two. And interestingly, when education comes to the colonies, to the United States, it's a bit of an amalgam of the British system with some influences from the French and German as well. The first, people often say Harvard College was the first university established in America. Actually, that's not quite true. The University of Mexico was established in 1551 by the Spaniards who were coming to colonial Mexico. Harvard College was established in 1636, so about 75 years later. The primary focus of Harvard College in 1636 was to train young men for the ministry. Young men specifically. It was not open to women. It's a very select group of people who were typically the children of ministers, typically the upper middle class, if not the richest Americans, and again, being trained for the ministry. The second university of the time was College of William and Mary in 1693, and like Harvard, it focused on what was then called liberal arts. And what was called the liberal arts in the late 17th century is interesting and instructive because it's quite different from today. The typical subjects in the liberal arts in the late 17th century were Greek and Latin. You had to learn Greek and Latin. Geometry, logic, rhetoric, ethics, and ancient history. And what's interesting about that is we don't often think of mathematics and logic in the same breath as language learning, ethics, and rhetoric. But all of those were thought to be liberal arts in the sense that they trained the mind, they helped to create that filter, but also provided a certain rigor. The typical method at Harvard and at the College of William and Mary in the late 17th century was repetition. You repeated things over and over until you learned them. There was a lot of emphasis on memorization and recitation. It was only later in the 18th and 19th century that the emphasis started to change from recitation and repetition in the United States to a somewhat more Humboldtian model of individual research and writing. In the next segment, we'll be talking more about that. We'll be looking pretty specifically at the U.S. Education in the industrial age. And in that segment, we're going to expand from higher education to all education, including primary and secondary education. But there's certain key words I'd like you to keep in mind as we move to the next segment in our focus on, again, primarily U.S. industrial education. One, timeliness. Much of 19th century American education focused on being on time and doing things on time. Two, hierarchy. This is a carryover very much from the older system and from the French system too, where what was important was who the headmaster was, who the professeur was. Even in the German system, who the Herr Doctor Professor was that you were studying with. Three, and now this is from the Humboldtian University, productivity. Not just making new knowledge, but how much were you making? How could you make it faster, better, and more? Four, standardization. It's interesting, the 19th century becomes more and more interested in a standardized form of education, which you might say comes from the French system. Five, scientific method and scientific metrics. This is using methods from industry and from science to assess productivity, even when assessing the intellectual knowledge, the new knowledge that's produced in higher education. Four, and this is something that'll be a recurrent theme when we get to the contemporary future of higher education, the idea of the two cultures, the separation of the scientific and mathematical and technological knowledge from the interpretive, creative, artistic, historical knowledge. And for the first time, math is no longer part of the liberal arts, but is part of science and is somehow separated from rhetoric, which is very curious, a very curious historical accident that logic and mathematics would move to the science side of the equation and away from such things as rhetoric and writing and reading. Finally, teaching, not learning, but teaching, and again, top-down, having knowledge to communicate to others. Those are some of the keywords of 19th century industrial age education, and that's what we'll be focusing on next time. Thank you.